Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. Coronavirus shutdown, doing all these videos online. They're on my YouTube channel. These videos are intended for use by students enrolled in my class, for the way I teach the class, for the breadth and the depth and the detail of the information that I want my students to know for my exams. If someone out there in YouTube land stumbled across these videos and you're not enrolled in my class, they may not cover the same level of detail or the topics in a way that your instructor covers. Always refer back to your classes, to your notes, to your textbooks. But if you do find these helpful, keep watching my videos. They'll set the foundation, and then you can start to plug in the details where they make sense. Now, we've been doing all the endocrine videos. This is we've been doing the simple endocrine reflexes. I believe this is the third or fourth video in the simple endocrine reflexes. We did insulin and glucagon, and then we've done calcitonin, parathyroid hormone, melatonin, thymosins, and erythropoietin. The last one we have left to do are called the mineral corticoids. Now, typically when it comes to the simple endocrine pathways, we have a stimulus detected by an endocrine organ. We have to name the organ. When we know the stimulus, we have to name the hormone. We know the target, so we'll know the response. The mineral corticoids, and the number one mineral corticoid that our body uses is a compound called aldosterone. They are considered a simple endocrine reflex because they don't involve the brain and the pituitary gland. But they're not quite as simple as all the other ones we've been covering, okay? And one bit of advice, guys, when you're studying, if you're struggling with these and you're losing confidence and you're getting freaked out, start with the simple hormone. Write it and write it and write it. Write the steps over and over and over till you can get it. Then do another simple hormone, one that's really easy to do. Get a little momentum going, get your confidence back, and then you can plow through the difficult ones. I'm the exact opposite. I don't stress out about stuff, so I start with the complex ones, and I get the hard work done early. I learned that from playing football and basketball. Do your hard work early, and it gets easier in the end. So for those of you that are very confident with this, start with the difficult hormones that take a lot more time to learn, and as you get tired learning all these, the easier ones become easier, okay? Either way, you need to learn all the hormones. Do one hormone at a time, do it till you can't stand it, and then do it 3 or 4 more times. And then keep practicing them. All right, so now we're gonna do the mineral corticoids. They don't follow this paradigm quite, so I'm gonna erase this drawing, and I'm gonna do a different picture for you. And I'm going to explain it, and then I'm going to list the steps. This one has a lot going on, and one day you'll thank me when you go learn how it's tied to all the other systems. So now, if I had a person's head sitting up here, we're going to draw someone's face, just so I get a little bit of reference. Down here would be a person's lungs. Okay? Down below all of that is an organ in the body called the liver. And then we're going to have our kidneys. And sitting on top of our kidneys, I'm going to make some really large adrenal glands. They're really not this big, right? We have the medulla, the middle of the kidney, and then we have what's called the adrenal cortex. Now, for those of you that don't know this yet, when we studied the slide in lab, what we learn is the adrenal gland is really several layers. Your adrenal gland has a capsule on the outside, and in the middle is the medulla. And we know that the medulla releases norepinephrine or adrenaline. It was the first hormone we did for prolonged stress, global sympathetic response. You should understand that. This whole layer out here is called the cortex. All the way around, this is the cortex. The cortex is divided into 3 sublayers. One of the layers is rather thin, there's a thicker layer, and there's another thick layer. This first layer, I'm going to put 1, 2, and 3 here. The first layer is called the zona glomerulosa. Zona means zone of. It's the glomerular zone or the zona glomerulosa. The second layer, and these are all the adrenal cortex. The second layer of the adrenal cortex is called the zona fasciculata. Okay? And the third layer of the adrenal cortex is called the zona reticularis. Okay? We're going to talk about the zona glomerulosa. We have already talked about the zona fasciculata. That's where the glucocorticoids come from. Remember, corticoid means steroidal hormone from the adrenal cortex. Corticoid. And the glucocorticoids are a steroidal hormone from the adrenal cortex that do sugar metabolism and sugar balance. The mineralocorticoids from the glucocorticoids from the zona fasciculata do sugar balance. The mineralocorticoids from the zona glomerulosa are going to do mineral balance or salt balance. Minerals are salts or the ions, sodium, potassium, chloride, and that such. So we're going to focus on the zona glomerulosa. I don't want to draw it in this little tiny drawing, okay? But you can understand what I'm talking about. Now, here's what's happening. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, our liver is releasing a compound called angiotensinogen. So the liver is releasing this compound into our bloodstream called angio. Angio refers to blood vessels, like an angioplasty. Tensin refers to tension or pressure, and this hormone happens to be called angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen is the generator of angiotensin. Now, angiotensinogen is an inactive enzyme. It's an inactive compound or hormone. It's not doing anything. It's floating around in your blood. If you were going to go into battle and I gave you a hand grenade, would you want an active hand grenade or an inactive hand grenade to carry around? You don't want to pull the pin. Once we alter it by pulling the pin, it's going to do its job. You don't want that to happen until you need it to happen, okay? So our body has angiotensinogen in our bloodstream right now, inactive, doing nothing, okay? Now, when our blood pressure gets low, when our blood pressure gets low, when our sodium and potassium and chloride concentration, particularly sodium and chloride, become too low, or blood pressure and blood volume become too low, we can detect that in the kidneys. So I'm going to write a stimulus over here. It's going to get messy on the board, but follow my little diagram as you can. But due to low blood pressure, low blood volume, blood pressure, blood volume, BP, BV, decreased renal blood flow. Now we've already seen this when we did erythropoietin. Blood flow and blood flow to the kidneys and blood pressure in general is so important for feeding all the oxygen and glucose, shoveling it to our cells along with other nutrients, that we have a whole bunch of hormones that are monitoring blood pressure and that can raise it. So due to decreased blood pressure, blood volume, or renal blood flow, this is all the stimuli that can set this system off, okay? And a low concentration of sodium and chloride ions in your blood. You just don't have enough salt. All of those stimuli can be detected by our kidneys. Our kidneys are monitoring blood pressure, blood volume, and renal blood flow, and they have chemoreceptors that are sensitive to sodium and chloride levels. When they detect that, the kidneys will release a compound called renin. Renin is an enzyme. And what renin does is it's going to convert angiotensinogen into a compound called angiotensin 1. So, angiotensinogen is in our blood. It's inactive, like you carrying a grenade. Renin is going to cause us to activate angiotensinogen or convert it to angiotensin 1. It's like pulling the pin on a grenade. It's ready to do its job. Okay? So, when angiotensinogen encounters renin, it becomes a substance called angiotensin 1. That's the Roman numeral 1. Angiotensin 1 gets the job done, but it's sort of a weaker response, and we might need a stronger response if our blood pressure and blood volume levels drop really low very rapidly. So what happens is, as angiotensinogen goes through our bloodstream, our blood vessels are going to carry angiotensinogen to our lungs. Angiotensin 1. I'm going to abbreviate it as A1. As angiotensin 1 goes through the lungs, it comes out the other side as angiotensin 2. I'm not going to write the word angiotensin out, but that's angiotensin 2. And by the way, the enzyme that converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2 happens to be called ACE. And ACE stands for Angiotensin Converting Enzyme. This is an enzyme in your lungs. It actually happens to be made by a group of cells called type 2 pneumocytes. Pneumo meaning lungs and cyte meaning cell. Type 1 and type 2 pneumocytes have different functions. Type 2 pneumocytes have these receptors on them called ACE. It's a protein in the membrane called ACE, or angiotensin converting enzyme. One of the things it helps do, by the way, is produce fluid in the lungs, and this is exactly the protein that is attacked by, or at least current research shows, that the COVID-19 or the coronavirus, COVID-19 itself, this novel version of the coronavirus, binds to these receptors, causes overproduction of fluid in the lungs, and causes pneumonia. So we're working on all of this, but anyway. So angiotensin converting enzyme is an enzyme produced by cells in our lungs that will convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a stronger form of the enzyme. It gives a much more powerful response. So here's what happens. Angiotensin 2 is going to target the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. So I know I have it drawn here, but really it would go down here, right? The zona glomerulosa will secrete aldosterone, or I like to call it salty Aldo. That's my nickname for it, and I'll explain this in a moment. But aldosterone is a hormone. So aldosterone will go from the zona glomerulosa to our kidneys. So now I can say aldosterone targets the kidneys. What's going to happen at the kidneys is it's going to raise blood pressure, raise blood volume, which will increase renal blood flow, and it will increase, sorry, I didn't draw my arrow very well. It's hard to write at the bottom of the board. It will increase sodium and chloride retention at the kidneys. We pee out a lot of sodium and chloride in our urine. And aldosterone, the reason I like to call it salty Aldo, there actually used to be a restaurant in San Antonio, it's still there, but it's moved its location, called Aldo's Ristorante Italiano. And my classmates, one of my classmates worked there, and anytime they would mess up a dish or a drink and they were going to throw it out, we would study in the corner and he would give it to us. And so we would get to eat free. And one time that someone sent a dish back that was too salty. And when I was learning this hormone, I thought, oh look, salty Aldo. Aldosterone actually increases sodium retention in the kidneys. And due to osmosis, water will go wherever the higher salt concentration is. If I move the salt back over here, water will follow the salt. So water follows the salt, which raises your blood pressure and blood volume. Okay, I'll talk about that in a moment. So now, this is rather complex, okay? But this is what's going on. It's really a simple endocrine reflex because we're not involving the brain. But nonetheless, here's what's happening. Our liver is releasing angiotensinogen into your bloodstream 24/7. It is inactive, doing nothing. If I have a decreased blood pressure, blood volume, or renal blood flow, or not enough salt in my body, the kidneys detect that and release renin. Renin is an enzyme that will convert angiotensinogen, which is already in your blood, into angiotensin 1. Now, angiotensin 1 can go straight to the zona glomerulosa and cause aldosterone release, but is a very weak response and doesn't do the job well enough. But as we release it, some of the angiotensin 1 goes through the lungs, where an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme converts it from type 1 to type 2, angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 goes to the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex, and when it binds to those cells, they release aldosterone. Aldosterone will go from the adrenal gland to the kidney, and at the kidneys, aldosterone will increase sodium and chloride retention. Water follows the salt. As I retain more salt and more water, the volume of blood goes up. As the blood volume goes up, so does the blood pressure, which will restore renal blood flow. Okay? So I hope that you see all of that. I hope the drawing makes sense. I like to draw it. Now some students don't like to do that, so I'm going to erase a great deal of this and I'm going to write the steps out. Okay? So give me a second to erase. I hope you got this all in your notes. And I'm going to leave some of this up so that I can refer back to the picture. Okay? And before I do this, I want to show you one last thing about this. This is how I teach osmosis and diffusion. If I have, and by the way, osmosis and diffusion are really important concepts that you learn in part 1. We think they're just definitions to remember, to memorize so you can make an A, but we're going to use them all the time in physiology. We're going to do this a lot. So if I have two areas of solution separated by a semi-permeable membrane, let's say one side has a very high salt concentration. Let's say this is sodium and chloride, and the other side has a low salt concentration. If salt can cross the membrane, it will. Diffusion will occur, and it will go from the area of high concentration of salt to an area of lower salt concentration. If salt cannot cross the membrane, in many instances water will, and water will move in the opposite direction, from the area of low solute or salt concentration to an area of higher solute concentration. Now, what happens is, what if I move all this salt over here? What if I pump a whole bunch of it? It doesn't normally move, but what if I put a little pump in the membrane here that I can physically pump the salt all the way across and move a bunch of it to this side? Now that I've switched my salt concentration to over here, water follows the salt. And that's exactly what happens. This would be urine, which would be high in sodium and chloride. But aldosterone targets these little proteins in our kidney tubules and causes them to pump salt from our urine back into our bloodstream. As I move the salt back into the bloodstream, the water that I was going to pee out will follow the salt. That will raise my blood volume, raising my blood pressure, restoring renal blood flow. That's sort of the mechanism behind it, is that aldosterone causes our kidneys to retain salt. Water follows the salt, raises blood pressure and blood volume. So now let's write out the steps of this whole situation. So follow along. Due to a low blood pressure, low blood volume, and low renal blood flow, or a low concentration of sodium and chloride in our blood, the kidneys release renin. Renin converts angiotensinogen angiotensinogen from the liver into angiotensin 1. I'm not going to write the word out. You can look it up. Angiotensin 1 passes through the lungs, where ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 targets the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex and causes it to release aldosterone. Aldosterone, which is a mineral corticoid, works on minerals, targets the kidneys to increase sodium and chloride retention. and I'm running out of board, but the next line would say, water follows the salt, which raises blood volume, raises blood pressure, raises renal blood flow, and the absorption of the sodium raises your sodium and chloride levels. Okay? So after aldosterone targets the kidneys, it will increase sodium and chloride retention, pull it out of our urine, put it back into our blood. Water follows the salt. The increased water reabsorption will raise blood volume, blood pressure, and restore renal blood flow. So hopefully you got all of aldosterone down. Excuse me. It's called a mineral corticoid because it works on minerals or salts. Got it? All right, listen. I got one more video that I'm going to do, which is going to be a review of the hormones. And I hope you guys had as much fun as I did learning this. I hope you practice it till you can't stand it. And by the way, blood pressure and blood flow has a great deal to do with how much oxygen we're picking up at the lungs for energy metabolism. So it makes sense that blood pressure and blood flow monitored by our kidneys is also tied to blood flow through the lungs. There, as I increase blood pressure and blood volume, I will also get increased oxygenation of my tissues and so on and so forth. They're all kind of connected. Anyway, I hope you had as much fun as I did. I hope you learned something. We got one more endocrine video to do, which is just a review. And I hope to see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching.